So I have a book out recently called The Doom Loop. I've been told the title of the book is dark, but my view is that the world has become even darker. And it's become dark essentially because we are stuck in this very negative dynamic where economics, domestic politics, and geopolitics have become stuck in this negative feedback loop.
Eswar Prasad speaking at a debate on the global economy at the IMF World Bank spring meetings. Prasad has long observed, analyzed, and written about economic trends and how strong institutions generally have helped keep the various economic crises manageable. But his latest book suggests this time is different.
So the reason for worry is that in the last few years, because of the dynamics of the doom loop, we've seen significant erosion of these institutions in practically every country, even in economies that one might think of as paradigms of liberal market-oriented democracies.
Eswar Prasad is a professor at Cornell University and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. So I was interested to read about your growing up in Madras, India, reading second-hand magazines to get a peek at the world outside your neighborhood, and dreaming of one day visiting the U.S. with all its Hollywood stars and powerful people you were reading about. Your book, The Doom Loop, talks about global power and what it takes to achieve that. Is culture still a factor in those terms, do you think? Or is it all about economics now?
So the notion of America having streets paved with gold and the place where all dreams would come true was certainly very prevalent during my time. The fact that we now have more channels of getting information, and America is now beginning to be seen for the reality, which is a little less golden than the perceptions, has certainly shifted a little bit. But my sense is that culture still plays an important role. You know, if you think about the English language, it is still the dominant language in the policy world in particular. And that can have a very important implication for narratives that in turn have implications for power. So if you think about the leading newspapers of the world that most policymakers around the world read, those are still English language newspapers, many of them with bases in the United States or as close ally the United Kingdom. And that certainly has a very big effect. Now, of course, there are other phenomena related to music, movies, and so on, where the U.S. is not as dominant as it used to be. But I think the U.S. still retains a cachet that few other economies have managed.
Mm-hmm. So what is this doom loop that you describe in your book that's dragging us down?
So when I started thinking about the world economic order and the way in which it was evolving, I had a pretty clear thesis in mind for a book, and that was going to be a rather cheerful book about how we are moving from a world in which, in the 1990s, after the demise of the Soviet Union, the United States became the dominant power in every respect, military, financial, economic. And now we are in a world where at least economic power is more evenly distributed. The emerging market countries, as we call them, countries like China, India, Brazil, have accreted a lot more economic power. And one might think that more evenly distributed power should be good, at least in an economist's view, for efficiency, for balance, and for stability, because no single country in that power configuration can get away with reckless policies, because there are other countries that the world could turn to as investment destinations or as sources of power. As I started working on the book, though, it soon became apparent to me that many of the forces I had in mind were in fact more likely to generate instability rather than stability. So that became the framing device of the book.
So you did not set out to write The Doom Loop. It was another book that you had in mind then.
I even had a title for the book. It was High Stakes.
Wow.
The idea that we needed to think about how to make sure all these positive forces would in fact get us back towards this new era of stability. So as I thought about these negative effects, it became clear to me that I needed to think about economics, domestic politics, and geopolitics as being very connected. Now, they've always been connected. They go along parallel tracks and often they intersect with each other. But we are at a moment right now where it's impossible to separate these out. And the framing device for the book became the doom loop in which economics, domestic politics, and geopolitics reinforce each other in a negative loop. That is, they bring out the worst in each other rather than the best in each other. And one phenomenon that I speak about in the book is that of globalization. One can think about global trade and financial flows as bringing benefits to all countries. And this was true, and it, in my view, is still true, that globalization, including free trade, generates benefits for all countries. So it's a positive sum game. Every country benefits at the same time. And this is important not only for progress economically, but also it serves as a counterbalance to the intrinsically zero-sum game of geopolitics. So in geopolitics, one country gains influence that has to come at the expense of another country. Economics, on the other hand, can be a positive sum game, and that can make sure that geopolitics stays in balance.
Well, it can be a positive gain, but the perception is of globalization that it's more like a zero-sum game these days. When someone benefits from globalization, there's others that lose out.
That's exactly right, Bruce. What has happened is that globalization itself has come to be seen as a zero-sum game, or in some quarters even as a negative-sum game. And that has very serious implications. Number one, for greater trade and financial integration, because that has a lot of benefits. And it also has implications for geopolitical stability. So it's worth thinking about what went wrong, because after all, in the 1990s and the 2000s, it looked like globalization was helping to pull millions out of poverty in countries like China and India. Even the United States was experiencing a lot of benefits, which we economists can measure. But what was happening at the same time was that there was this very disaffected class in the United States and other richer countries which felt that none of these benefits were flowing to them. And what is worse, they saw that the political system was being captured by the political and economic elites that were already gaining from globalization, technology, and other forces at play during this period. So a lot of people felt they were losing opportunity, and they saw that the government's policies, regulatory policies, tax policies, were favoring those who were already gaining most of the benefits. So this created a very negative political dynamic, and we are seeing those play out to this day, where there is a sense that it is a problem that the other is what is responsible for people losing out. And the other can be defined in any way that a skillful politician wants. It can be domestic political and economic elites, or it can be the forces of globalization. It can be immigrants pouring over a country's borders, or it can be China. So now you see how economics has a negative effect on domestic politics, and that, of course, affects geopolitical relationships. So one might think about the US-China tensions on trade and other matters, but also spilling over into the geopolitical dimensions as being part of this negative feedback loop.
So one thing that I found surprising was the disparities in income per capita between economic powers, like India, which you say is likely to become the third largest economy by 2030, yet its per capita income is dramatically lower than, compared to the U.S. What does that tell us about how the global economy is working these days?
So logically, there should be shared interests among the major economies if you define the major economies in terms of how large they are. But what you're pointing out is something that is very specific to the present moment, that the countries that are accreting more economic power in terms of the overall size of their economies, say as measured by national GDP, are not necessarily matching up to the traditional powers, the old advanced economies that used to be the industrial powers, because there is a gulf in terms of their per capita incomes. Certainly, China and India have seen significant increases in per capita incomes, but if you think about India's per capita income, it's still a small fraction of those of major advanced economies, including the United States. China is further ahead, but it too has a much lower per capita income. And this difference in per capita income affects how different groups of countries see the apportionment of both blame and the responsibility for mitigating factors and issues on which they have common interest and should be working together. So if you think about climate change, for instance, one would think that every country wants to do what it can to mitigate the negative effects of climate change. But in fact, what we see is that the emerging market countries feel that the advanced economies have benefited from their industrial strength, may have created a lot of pollution, and now are asking the emerging market economies to restrain their own development rather than compensating the emerging markets for all the problems that, in their view, have been caused by the advanced economies. So the gulf in per capita incomes causes the gulf in perceptions about who is to blame and who should bear the cost of changes to these policies. So unfortunately, what this means is that even though you have more parity in terms of economic size, you still have huge conflicts in terms of areas where there ought to be cooperation instead.
And in terms of measuring economic activity, you also make an interesting point about how when you use purchasing power exchange rates versus the usual market exchange rates, how that paints a dramatically different picture of what's going on in our economies. What is the difference there?
So when one wants to compare measures like gross domestic product or GDP across countries, that is how much output a country creates each year in terms of producing goods and services, one needs a common unit of measure, a common currency for comparing across countries. And typically what one uses is a measure of the domestic currency relative to a common currency, typically the US dollar, so that one can compare GDP across countries. But it turns out that market exchange rates are not very good measures of how much the purchasing power of a currency is within that country in itself. So, for instance, if you think about the exchange rate between the Chinese renminbi and the US dollar, that may be very different from the ability to get a certain amount of goods and services within China, which may be quite different from the market exchange rate. Why? Because certain things like haircuts and, a cup of coffee and so on might be much cheaper in China when measured in the domestic currency. So if you account for these purchasing power differences, it turns out that countries like China and India look even bigger than based on market exchange rates. But I argue in the book that you need to think very hard about what question you're addressing when you look at different measures. Certainly, if one was to look at the amount of consumption purchasing power, it might look that China is in fact, an even larger economy than the United States. But if you're looking at international competition, competition for resources, competition for economic influence and so on, then it's really the market exchange rate that matters a lot more. So both of these measures are equally valid, but the issue is always what is the question you're trying to address and what would then be the right measure to address that.
All right, so this long-standing U.S. dollar dominance comes up a lot in the book, and you bring up stuff that we don't often hear about, like how the U.S. benefits from its dominance, especially when it comes to trade, just in terms of those exchange rates that we were talking about just now. Maybe paint us a picture of what trading in dollars means for countries and how the U.S. comes out on top in this scenario.
If you are a U.S. importer or exporter, the fact that all of the trade that you do is denominated in the currency that you're most familiar with and can use easily, which is the U.S. dollar, makes things a lot easier. If you're a trader in another country that has to trade in dollars, you always have to worry about the exchange rate between your domestic currency and the value of the U.S. dollar. And I keep saying the U.S. dollar because it turns out that a substantial fraction of global trade is denominated in U.S. dollars. So, for instance, if Brazil and China are trading with each other, a lot of that trade is still denominated and settled in U.S. dollars because the dollar is the easiest, the cheapest currency to use. Now, it turns out that for the U.S., this is very convenient because it means there is a greater demand for dollars for trade, But it also turns out that there is a lot of demand for dollars as a reserve currency, which is what central banks keep their rainy day funds in. And the reason is similar, that the dollar is the easiest to use worldwide. So if a country is having trouble paying for its imports, for instance, if it has a stock of dollars, foreign exchange reserves denominated in dollars, it can very easily fill in that gap. So both as a payment currency and as a reserve currency, the dollar is still dominant, and that has some benefits for the U.S. So, for instance, it makes it a lot easier for U.S. exporters and importers. But in addition, it means that the world is willing to accept dollars, and it's also willing to finance the U.S. Trade deficit, which is the amount by which U.S. Imports exceed exports. So if a country persistently imports more than it exports, somebody has to pay for it. And it turns out the rest of the world is willing to finance U.S. trade deficits. And it also turns out, because the U.S. dollar is a dominant reserve currency, it means that the U.S. government can issue debt, some of which is bought by foreign investors. So this again makes it a lot easier for the U.S. government to finance its budget deficits. So both U.S. budget deficits and trade deficits are now financed by the rest of the world, and the dollar dominance is an important part of that. Now, it is not entirely a benefit to the U.S. because there is one minor problem, which is greater demand for U.S. dollars means that the U.S. dollar's exchange rate relative to other currencies is higher than it would otherwise be. And this means that American exporters will find their products harder to sell in global markets, because the strength of the U.S. dollar is going to make it more expensive for importers from the rest of the world to buy American products. But of course, the flip side of that is that for American consumers, it's going to make foreign goods much cheaper. And in fact, that may be the reason, one of the reasons why the U.S. continues to run trade deficits, because, a strong dollar makes it easier to import more and export less.
So why is it that the American dollar continues to be so dominant? I mean, most of the world is maybe fed up of having the dollar so dominant. Why does it remain so dominant?
So the entire world would desperately like to diversify away from or ditch the dollar entirely, because it gives the U.S. enormous power in many respects. And one might argue there are some benefits to the entire world, coordinating on one currency. But I think the reality is that the world doesn't want to be so dependent on the dollar. So why is the dollar dominant?
Yeah.
I argue it's everybody else's fault, because if a country wants its currency to play an important role in international finance, for instance, the Chinese would dearly like the renminbi to play a more important role in global finance. But for that to happen, you need to make it very easy for foreign investors to bring money into China and take money out. The exchange rate needs to be freely determined by market forces rather than tightly controlled by the central bank. And you also need very deep and liquid financial markets, meaning a lot of financial instruments being available in that currency and being very easy to trade. You also need a strong institutional framework, the rule of law, an independent central bank, a system of checks and balances, all of which inspire the trust of both domestic and foreign investors. Now, one might make a legitimate argument that all of these elements of the institutional framework that I spoke about, that in my view have been really important for dollar dominance, are really being eroded. But in international finance, it's all relative. The U.S. does not necessarily need to have the best institutions in the world, but the combination of institutions, financial markets, economic size, economic dynamism that the U.S. brings to the table, that combination is right now not matched by any other country. So the U.S. dollar remains dominant essentially by default.
So one thing that you make clear in the book is that instability and chaos are now status quo. It's the state of this new world. So do we need to be building new institutions that can deal with that reality? I mean, our existing institutions are seeming a little lost in this scenario, no?
In the cheerful version of the book, Bruce, I had a very clear answer to what would be the corrective mechanism that took us back to a better place. All of these forces that I talk about in the book. And, in addition to globalization, I talk about how the rules of the game, everybody agreeing on a common set of rules could play an important stabilizing role, how the middle powers could play a stabilizing role, and even technology. But ultimately, it's really through institutions that we get balance in the global system, and that requires good domestic institutions as well as international institutions. So I listed some of the domestic institutions already: the system of checks and balances, the rule of law. So the government may create rules, but even it has to be subservient to those rules. A free and fearless press that can hold public officials to account, and also specific institutions like an independent central bank that is free to take policy decisions in order to attain its objectives, which are typically low inflation and supporting growth. Those are really important, and we have certainly seen a great deal of erosion of those institutions, even in economies that one might think of as paradigms of liberal market-oriented democracies, many of the Western economies. But we also need good international institutions, the ones that are dear to our own hearts, the International Monetary Fund, where we are right now, but also the World Bank, the United Nations, and so forth. And unfortunately, many of these institutions have lost legitimacy from both sides, from advanced economies, in particular the United States, which feels, based on a very narrow perception of what its interests are, that these institutions are not serving its interests well. And emerging market economies like China and India feel that these institutions are still under the control of the advanced economies. But I think it's this combination of good domestic institutions as well as international institutions that can take us back to the path to stability. So the reason for worry is that in the last few years, because of the dynamics of the doom loop, we've seen significant erosion of these institutions in practically every country. And my book is not a book about the present administration or just about the United States, but we see these forces at play in many countries around the world, many countries that again used to be seen as paragons of democracy. And likewise, many of these institutions, international institutions that I spoke about, have been very important as an anchor for global prosperity and stability. So I think the answer really must lie in institutions, but it is an interesting moment to ask whether the institutions that I'm speaking about had any intrinsic fragilities, so that small changes at the margin are not going to be sufficient. Maybe this is a moment of opportunity. These institutions are facing real danger. Maybe we should start anew and create institutions that are based on some of the principles I lay out in my book, like fairness, transparency, the ability to evolve in terms of their structures with changing economic realities and so on. So there is, when one thinks about institutions, much room for concern, but also some grounds for optimism.
But interestingly, you also point out that China is sort of the glaring exception to that rule that, it takes strong institutions, all those things that you just said, for economic success. Like, have they found a loophole around that?
So my sense is that China has done a very good job at managing a difficult balance. And certainly what China is providing to the world is a completely different vision of how you should structure a legal, political, economic, and social system. And this is an interesting contrast to what we had come to see in the 1990s and 2000s, as something that had been conclusively determined. There was talk about the end of history, for instance, the notion that the paradigm of liberal market-oriented democracy had triumphed, and that was the paradigm to which every country would aspire. China setting out a new path. It does come with certain risks. I think the Chinese system has become increasingly rigid over time. That does provide some degree of control, some stability, but it also introduces a certain element of brittleness. But I must say that my optimism that the notion of market-oriented democracies would win out has been shaken a little bit, and there is one reason for that. I think many people, including myself, had assumed that once people attained a certain level of economic progress, that their basic needs for food, shelter, and so on were met, that they would aspire to higher order freedoms, the freedom of speech, of association, of religion, and so on. But it is striking, and I have many examples in the book of how people seem to be willing to give up or trade off these higher order freedoms or even basic liberties, so long as that they can be assured of economic security and other forms of security as well. And in the hands of skillful politicians, fear is a very powerful emotion that seems to work a lot better than hope. And this is why, again, I worry that we are stuck in this doom loop where rather than aspiring to higher standards, we end up moving towards the lowest common denominator, where rather than having more freedoms, we have fewer freedoms, and we believe that we are actually becoming a lot more secure because we have given up those freedoms.
So finally, I'll put a question that you raise at the very start of the book back to you. Given what you've discovered while writing The Doom Loop, do you still believe that liberal democracy and free market capitalism go hand in hand? I mean, is that a vision that you think will help us out of this mess?
That vision, I think, needs to be refined further because what I think the last couple of decades have shown us is that model has some intrinsic fragilities, and the particular fragility that I emphasize in the book is the susceptibility of the political system to capture by political and economic elites. So things like globalization certainly have created a lot of progress, but at the aggregate level, and if we don't come up with good distributive mechanisms that allow people to feel that they can share in this progress, and especially if we feel, or if many people feel that the system is stacked against them in a way that they can never clamber back onto the economic ladder of opportunity, that is a real problem. And this problem is going to be intensified because of technological changes around us these days. If you think about the gains to be had from artificial intelligence, AI, those are likely to be quite substantial, but it is also likely that on net, we don't have employment gains as a result of AI. And I think there are some legitimate concerns that we might, in fact, have some employment prospects, especially in specific occupations or specific sectors, shrink. So we need to find a way to reduce the susceptibility of political systems, democracies to capture, and we also need to find better ways of sharing the benefits of all these technological changes, globalization, other factors that I think can really improve material prosperity.
Eswar Prasad, a professor of economics at Cornell University, also a senior fellow at Brookings, and author of several books, the latest being The Doom Loop, the topic of our conversation today. Thank you so much, Eswar.
Bruce, that's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Look for a review of Eswar Prasad's latest book, The Doom Loop, in the June issue of Finance and Development magazine. Go to imf.org/F&D. And look for other IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen. You can also follow us on X. Our handle is @IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.